like to invite to the lectern Professor Jaroslava Vydrová, who is a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Slovak Academy of Sciences and a professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and Art of the Trnava University. She's also currently the Vice President of the Central and East European Society for Phenomenology. So, please.
The title of my presentation today is Phenomenology in Central Europe and Action Art, with which I would like to contribute to the theme of the conference because it is based on a certain coexistence and togetherness that has developed in our region. Research concerning the specific development of phenomenology in Central and Eastern Europe has been progressing in recent years and has reached interesting content and methodological results. They point to the specificity of the phenomena of Central and Eastern European intellectual history, which cannot be seen only in relation to the Western European tradition of historicity, since it has to some extent lost the possibility of direct contact with it due to historical circumstances, and at the same time have created a distinctive regional narrative. In my paper, I would like to look at this perspective through perhaps surprising topic, namely the action art, happenings and performances which are linked to phenomenology not only historically, not only because of historical context, but also, as I will try to show, by more fundamental penetration and starting points. I will ask following questions. In what ways were these artists' achievements close to phenomenology, and how can this art be interpreted phenomenologically? In the first part, I will focus on the shared historical context of phenomenology and art production and the intersections. And in the second part, on the phenomenological possibilities of interpreting the action art as well as the rapprochement. I will look for answers to these questions in the work of the phenomenologists and artists in Czechoslovakia of this period. When the exhibition of Jan Patočka, Philosoph und Staatsfeind, Philosopher and Public Enemy, was held at the Czech Center in Vienna at the turn of 2022 and 2023, its conception was based primarily on the last period of Patočka's life, connected with Charter 77 and the tragic events that led to his death on 13th March of 1977. In addition to Patočka's text devoted to the care of the soul and the idea of Europe, the exhibition was joined by examples of art from the 70s, such as works by Václav Havel, Jan Močoch, Milan Knížák, Věra Nováková, Jindřich Přibík, and Petr Štembera. The beginning and the end of the exhibition were accompanied by performances of contemporary artists Tomáš Štípil and David Helán. Although Patočka was not involved in this kind of art during his life, this connection on exhibition was not accidental and offers several questions. Philosophy was very close to the artist's work during this time, and so we see similar tendencies here. This period is divided into two stages: Golden 60s from 1961 to 1968, and the normalization and rebuilding period from 1969 and to 1989, and was marked by, at first, by a burst of creativity, but then by its limitation and causing a gradual or sudden transfer of actors from the official to the gray or unofficial sphere. Here, people from different fields, ideological platforms and genres have come together, and different kinds of contrast and synergies have emerged, creating a strange plurality that is intrinsically productive. There were environmentalists, writers, poets, philosophers, painters, who were linked by that where they found themselves. These forms of thought and creation were in sharp contrast to official production of that time, which was subject to institutional censorship, prescribed writing in the case of philosophy and production in the case of art, according to expected uniform criteria of both ideas and forms, and thus self-censorship of the author. On the contrary, there were examples of diversity and creativity in unofficial sphere, with so-called suitcase exhibitions and happenings, as well as samizdat writings, such as, for example, magazine Contact, whose summer supplement Contact to Water in 1981 published Erazim Kohak's text on life in truth, Robert David's experimental poetry, anonymous excerpt from the prose of the later well-known Slovak writer Pavel Vilikovský for Evergreen. Issue 4 published Patočka's text The Spiritual Man and the Intellectual. Let's look now on action art. What common features can be identified with phenomenology? First of all, there is a common resonance that phenomenology and the action art shared during the communist regime as expressions of free thought and agency. This interpretative lineage of this kind of phenomena is present in authors such as Michael Gubser or Aviezer Tucker. However, I will be interested in a different layer of interpretation, namely the emergence and resonances of so-called local phenomena that could also be described as marginal. Marginalization has affected the form of production in specific ways and influenced distinctive forms of thematization. But it is also concerned in a particular reflection on the creative self and its relation to history. If we look at these two aspects, so creative self and relation to history, in the first case, it was a question of subjectivity, problematization of authorship, which was addressed on a scale from erasure, anonymization, writing in a drawer, to autobiography and self-thematization, so to say, an archaeology of the self. In-depth studies of subjectivity and its experience were manifested in all its broadness and complexity, from unconsciousness and conscious processes of perceiving, imagining, dreaming, hallucination, reflecting, acting in shifts and transformation, but also in radical fractures of life. On this basis, for example, Peter Zajac developed this kind of thinking about a distinctive poetics of creation, which culminated in his book From Aesthetics to the Poetics of Trembling. In the second case, it was a specific self-historization. Here we can refer to the Slovenian curator and art historian Zdenka Badovinac, who dealt specifically with the relationship between historicity and preservation and the self-thematization of the artist in marginalized spaces. A specific materiality emerges as expressivity and performativity, accompanied by an awareness of one's own historization. An example from this area is the text of The Machine of Time, where Slovak writer and translator Marta Frišová-Šimečková returns to Asimov's The Last Trump and problematizes the passage of time in relation to thought, happiness, and pain. I quote, "We are powerless against the passage of time, and perhaps that is why it is the most real reality for us." These tendencies appear in various forms much earlier as well. It can be said that work with subjective temporality and historicity is intrinsically linked to avant-garde and neo-avant-garde initiatives which appear here not only as a historical example, but have a wider significance for the actualization of creation, the reframing of programmatic goals, and need for constant renewal in creation, deconstruction, and construction. How can we interpret these findings in connection to phenomenology further? From above-mentioned perspective, the exhibition on Jan Patočka can be seen through the lens of the intrinsic interplay of divergent milieus linked by performativity and the interconnectedness of phenomenology and art, which shared interest in the creative possibilities of the self. The question of performativity also became interesting from a phenomenological point of view and was theoretically addressed by Patočka's student Petr Rezek, one of the most prominent figures of the Czech dissident milieu. He also devoted his text to phenomenological interpretations of body art, land art, pop art, and happenings. So let's proceed to the second part of the presentation, and thus the question of the phenomenological interpretation of the action art and the possible rapprochement. What do these kinds of art or of artistic performance convey? In the works of Petr Rezek, we find thematically and methodologically insightful and innovative contributions. He has been writing on the action art already since the year 1976, and it should be said that phenomenological text on this subject is still not extensively elaborated in phenomenological discourse. Rezek draws on short reports of performances, conversations with actors, or his own participation in happenings to which he was invited. What is the first thing that follows from this? The performances give a strange, disturbing impression when one participates in them. When one reads the accounts of the performances too, they are only a strict record of the event, verbally very modest, and nothing more. The action only happens, but its why is not justified, or it does not arise from the context of everyday life. They thus act as a strange redirection of expectations in the flow of ordinary experience. It should be pointed out that what is at stake here is not the definition of this art as such, but the interpretation of the events themselves called for from their primary description. And the first phenomenological step can be captured right here. Unlike the art theoretist, who starts from the fact of the work, which she analyzes and defines, the phenomenologist, according to Rezek, should uncover or open up and not presuppose, not bring anything to the analysis, but start from the experience of the work, which is both irreducible and unique. So, this primary analysis may repeat itself, but it can look different. However, unlike Walther Biemel, with whom Rezek otherwise shares the distinction between primary and secondary descriptions of the work of art, in pop art, for example, Rezek does not base his analysis on the natural world and on its critique of its averageness, repetition, stereotyping, but rather on experience, especially the experience of fascination with the natural world as a specific opening up of presence of the thing announcing itself in its various kinds of presenting and showing. Thus, instead of critique of consumerism, for example, this kind of art lets the thing appear in its how. In Oldenburg, it is the monstrosity as the presence of the object. We are fascinated by the strange presence of things. In Liechtenstein, for example, Rezek sees the revealing of the essence of the all, aptly described as the uncovering, concealment, and concealing, uncovering, are the presence of the enlarged part of the comic's right shows. Rezek writes, we find that the fascination that dominates in pop art demands that the natural world should be conceived in a deeper way than as a mere set of references. From the insight of the anchoring of the human natural world in something even deeper, then follows the turn in art to the elements, for example in land art, to that which gives all things. Another example of an action art from the Slovak environment are the events Bratislava Championship in the shifting of the artifact from 1979 to 1986, where it was about the reinterpretation of the artifact, an actual entry into the experience of communication with prominent artists. In the words of Vladimir Kordoš, the initiator of these events, the idea was to pay respect, but at the same time not to take oneself too seriously. Great art does not have to be a closed affair, but can find itself in a living communication between artist and artist. Other performances included the Athens School and the Homage à Messerschmitt. Phenomenological description can or should thus take place repeatedly in contact with the work of art. The experience is unique in its course. In a 1979 text, Rezek points out that what is at stake here is a specific presence, the bare presence of the situation, which, in the case of performance, shows itself but nothing else, does not allow another to enter into it, to participate in the situation. The bare presence of a body, a gesture, an action, a movement, or a thing points to the rupture of ordinary life mediated by art precisely by showing that this is a thing and nothing else, a thing in its appearance and only appearance. The performer or artist is the performer of this rupture, which, according to Rezek, opens up reality into two sides, the ordinary and the exceptional. Here, as in his other texts, Rezek also draws attention to the riskiness of this art, which may become merely an ordinary movement, but art does not, as it were, take place. According to him, the presence we call bare or naked cannot be found simply and at once. Performance brings a very strong experience, such as that of precariousness, of the intensity of a presence that usually passes us by. But performativity can return us to the present as a non-trivial expressive experience of the movement, of the self, of the event. Here, performance acts in the same way as mask or festivity, where the mask conveys an intense gaze without the possibility of reciprocation, or are mediators of another world in its otherness, which we cannot grasp in our notion, but at the same time we are, in a special way, there, in a performance. Let us mention one more example referred to in Rezek's text. He implements the interpretation of the performance through Medard Borth's interpretation of dreams. This idea was initiated by the artists Jan Močoch and Petr Štembera, who asked Rezek to help to understand, to interpret a dream, which was in fact a real life action called the Big Sleep. The use of Medard Borth turns out to be appropriate here because Borth rejects symbolic interpretation. In Rezek's words, I quote, "One thing does not represent another, but from what and how it appears, it is possible to see what the thing does not what the dreamer is open to, what possibilities his world is constituted by. First, then, it is necessary to know what makes the thing that the dreamer encounters that thing, to find substantive essential references. In this case of this action, Rezek interprets the essential characteristics of the loft on which the artist's performance took place. In paraphrase, as follows: the loft is the place that the house encloses, covers, and at the same time connects to the sky, connects the inside and outside. The loft is not inhabited, but rather it is a shelter for play, a hiding place for lovers, for those who want to retreat somewhere. By being in the action of hanging in the air without contact with the floor, it is a kind of being out of a place, a particular here that is actually nowhere, and represents the opening up of the all as a world. The performance ends with the announcement of the pain in the hands and thus return to bodily situatedness. Here Rezek's interpretation stops, because to continue, as he states, would already be an intervention into intimate realms. Rezek learned that it was a real action only after his interpretation. The brief record of the performer, which makes understanding difficult, sometimes even impossible to understand, was thus complemented by a phenomenological interpretation. Considering these examples, we could say that the action art here has a twofold relevance for phenomenology, as material for the phenomenological interpretation, but also as a certain fundamental insight into the reality and the course of experience. Similarly to the phenomenological procedure of uncovering the layers of experience, action art opens up reality in its unfolding by shifting from the factual, by suspending the everyday occurrences, and at the same time opening up that reality in the structure and in its presence for our experiencing. And it is an experience of a special kind, a modified, significantly purified, open to things in their bare presence. In other words, in a phenomenological way without supplements, derivations, and secondary meanings, but in a way, for example, of pure movement. That this is an experience of the kind of impossibility of participation in the work or of too strong action, of an intense present, does not contradict this. On the contrary, it points precisely to the unfolding of the action and on the one hand, and to a position similar to Husserl, uninterested observer on the other. The action art thus turns out to be an effort to the return to the things, the events themselves, in the similar way that the phenomenologist looks always anew into the structure of experience, reflecting on the stream of consciousness and intentional curvature. What happens in action, then, does not represent or mediate something other, secondary meaning, but simply shows. Just one more remark. For Husserl, as he states in Ideas 1, the realm of fantasy, variation, of imagination, provide a fertile ground for phenomenology, which is sufficiently free from transcendent obscurities and layers of meaning, dealing with various states of reality and referring. This connection is often used as starting point by analyses of intertwining of phenomenology and art. So does also Hans Rainer Sepp by the analysis of what's going on by the Cubist paintings, which likewise deconstruct representations and modify how we think about objects and appearances. As he states, both the phenomenologist and the artist face the same problem. How do things, in their being perceived, appear in the medium of image? Here Rezek can go further with the action art because it offers the shift from the imaginative reality of the classical image to the real reality of action. However, the action art places great demands on its audience, requiring them to free themselves from expectations, which are, however, often burdened by received but untested assumptions. It also places great demands on the artist. She may be able to create works of the highest order but may also not be successful and produce only normal, ordinary movement or action. According to Rezek, for example, pop art was not successful in Czech milieu. But it turns out that both action art and phenomenology stood not only historically but also thematically and programmatically at the same questions. Both initiatives were intended to be an active return to things, movements, and events. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture, and before I could finish my sentence, and thank you for your parallelization of phenomenology and art at a very specific also time period, which gives it all the more concreteness. I ask Professor Prole to pose the question.
Thank you. I like your examples, but I would like to add something to what we previously discussed in terms of relationship between individual and collective. The example I like the most is related to grotesque, let's say, description related to a kind of commenter to works of art appropriated by the institution of art already. And I found it relevant for phenomenological analysis deeply. But what, on the other hand, with the example, guy hanging alone somewhere in the attic, I found it totally, let's say, selfish monologue. That's experience for himself. I can't, as a phenomenologist, say anything about his simulation of dream hanging. It's kind of good example which relates to what Vitol said about monologue and collective approach. And we can find within the action art a lot of examples following both directions. Let's say Marina Abramović, for example, who is worldwide famous, she made an object of art from herself and presenting herself in MoMA gallery. Artist is present. I'm here, I made something by myself, through myself, in order to see to sitting next to me, in order to see me. It's something I cannot follow as a phenomenologist. So following my point would be, I'll comment that following your topic, we can say that collective kind of work, action arts are phenomenologically useful and the other one useless.
Yes.
We cannot cope with guys hanging somewhere alone.
Yes, it was also my problem. Thank you, Dragan. You are completely right. And also Rezek struggled with this example. And he said that he was so to say, in a trap because they told him that this was my dream and please interpret my dream through Medard Boss. Rezek was very good in phenomenological psychology. He was a translator of Medard Boss, and there was a circle in Prague using Dasein's analytical interpretation of dreams. So this artist described Rezek this as a dream. So I went to the roof and I was hanging. How can you help me to understand what was happening? Because these action artists, they were doing something, but were not sure whether it is art what they are doing. So he all the time came to Rezek and asked him for help to understand. And he said that this is not art. I don't understand you. It's what are you doing? It's not normal life. It's not art, and it's not about saying that I am now doing the art. But when he was in situation that he can interpret it as a dream, he used metarbos, and it was a bit functioning, because when you are interpreting dream, you can come closer to the description of significance of the world of the dreamer and the things which appeared there. It can function quite good in the dialogue. But when it is only written as a description of an action, it's empty. So he was also struggling with this. I think that probably pop art and body art and also performances where happenings where also other people are involved are phenomenologically very distinctive and good to practice phenomenology. But really this action art only as something what is individually happening and I don't record it on photograph is very difficult. It's very difficult, in fact. Yes, very risky. But and what I also like that we can go from example to example. That there's no need to make a general description, but to use this example in a living phenomenological practice in a way.
Yeah, risky in a way that the artist, him or herself, should be a phenomenologist at the same time, in order to offer some kind of, to provide some kind of description. That way, it's not possible to describe it from the outside. That's why.
They also tried to visit Patočka's lectures, but Patočka was a bit distant to this kind of art.
Conservative, yeah.
Yes, and it was like it was too much. But I was very impressed, and it functions very well when it was in one exhibition, like Patočka's Live, and supplemented also with these examples. It's also homage on these artists, also on Patočka.
Okay. Thank you. I think there are 3 more questions. So I don't know who is first, either Christian or Witold. Let's say Christian.
I'm wondering if, on the one hand, why only action art and not other types? In this ambivalence, artist and phenomenologist, let's remember Celibidache, the director, who put in practice the principle of creating music on Husserlian principle. So I think this ambivalence can be developed in other areas. But why motivated you to put the accent on the action art and not other? It was a specific idea of action.
One answer could be very, very easy, that I found texts on that and they were very unique in a sense because it's not present today, still today, and there are really very interesting interpretations of art from 60s and 70s right on this topic. Also pop art is very well interpreted through Rezek, very aptly. And he is in critical dialogue with Walter Biemel. It's also interesting, in a way he's going much further and say that Biemel stopped with a phenomenon fascination and went to critique. But I want to go to the experience of fascination. What does it mean? And why it functions in USA and does not function in Czech Republic, because we cannot perceive fascination in a way. So this would be one. I found it interesting and I found the text. The second, much more complicated, would be to find whether there are not some principal rapprochement of action art happenings and performances and phenomenology in Czechoslovakia, and development of phenomenology in Czechoslovakia, and also the framing of narrative of phenomenology in Central or in Czechoslovak or Central European realm, where this kind of initiatives and common questions, common problems were not same for phenomenologists and artists or sociologists and other. So this would be a much more complex question, and my idea is that this rapprochement was really dominant here, and something like neo-avant-garde and action art and this kind of art was much more authentic and much more philosophically close to the philosophical problems or to the problems which were at stake of this kind of art than were, for example, maybe in other part of Europe or abroad, in a sense. And that neo-avant-garde, so to say, reframe the movement of thinking, maybe also the movement of phenomenology itself, in the space from which I come. So my idea is that this can be elaborated more, and there are theorists and historians who are working on this or trying to work on this also critically, whether this is not at stake. I think we can go much deeper also in this. So I would go in this direction in the future research. And they were practicing all together in a way. They were meeting, they were discussing these problems. For example, Rezek, they had the lectures on phenomenological aesthetics, on phenomenological psychology, and they were somehow together practicing in some discussion. But of course, it is not very differentiated, so we do not have this material like very obvious.
I think the case of you presented its data interesting, of course. But I think in principle, if we can imagine for the future of a cross-fertilization between artists and phenomena, for example, a dancer who can put in his practice of dancing phenomenological means. I mentioned music, conducting music, to be didactic. Also, because until now we had like phenomenologists looking at the art and explaining, active, passive. And now, if this can be reversed, if art can challenge phenomenology, or it's a vice versa, a reverse movement.
Yeah, thank you for this input. I think it's a very good question, and it's also a very good way to go in the future. It has already been done, for example, in Czech Million in the context of Cubism, because Czech Cubists were also theoretically involved in the topic, and also they practice and were in discussion with philosophers and so on. So there were exchange of ideas and challenges, as you mentioned in the previous presentation. And also in dance, I don't know, Gallagher's interpretation of dancing also is interesting as a, how to say it, improvisation. He's working on improvisation and how the improvisation stop, like the dancers know when to stop. It's Gallagher's topic, elaborative, phenomenologically very interesting. So also this can be from those sides. Yes.
I think it was Vito. Do you wanted to ask something?
Yes. Thank you for this paper. I really enjoyed it. Very interesting. But I'm wondering about this question of Dragan, raised by Dragan, whether what does it mean that you phenomenologically interpret an action art? You know the book of John Searle, Intentionality in Action, for example. So his idea, you interpret action, you ascribe some intentions. And I think that your question also arises from this perspective that interpretation, the logical interpretation of an action means that you ascribe an intention. So if there was no audience, no one ascribed this intention, because what is this communal dimension, and I was wondering whether those examples you presented can be interpreted not in this egocentric interpretation of phenomenology, but subjective in Patočka's sense. I mean that, for example, action art is not describing action; it's acting. So this is action, and talking about this is not action. So maybe action art is comparable to phenomenology in the sense that it's not about understanding content of some materials, but as you said, the most important thing about action is that it manifests things, right? So when there was this guy hanging, I suppose that he didn't hang himself. So there was someone who made, for example, the picture, right? So this action had this communal aspect, and I think that maybe you can interpret this as a subjective phenomenological approach, namely that things appear just like action appear, and not descriptions of actions, as you said. So that they went to Rezek, so they asked what is happening there, and they act, and action was this art, right? This was artistic expression, and not a picture or description, but during this action something appeared. And I thought that maybe you can adopt this as subjective interpretation of this phenomenon. What do you think? Is it possible?
For pop art, for example, it's possible as subjective. The appearances of the bare, naked presence of the thing. There is difference between action art, like performances and happenings, and to differentiate it, whether we are involved in action, we are dealing with photographs only or reports, or whether we are somehow involved in concrete. For example, the auditory is involved in gallery, into the action art and so on. And this is, I think, very tricky because what we are doing as phenomenologists with this, whether we are describing what is happening, or whether we are describing the phenomena of, for example, the phenomena of being perceived, or phenomena doing something. They are realizing that we are doing something, we do not understand what we are doing, in a sense, so just describe this doing, in a sense. Just describe the appearing of the bare, naked present of the thing, which is repeated in the world, but in the art can be seen in its naked presence, or something like that. So it has different levels of interpretation, but probably the most boring is to say what's happening here, like description from the outside. The audience, there is a picture of what's happening. This is not phenomenological, but go more deeper to the structure, configuration of the situation, configuration of the appearing of the thing itself. It's interesting that how of the thing can be exceptional, can be different, can differ, and so on. So yes, a subjective phenomenology can connect it to Patočka. Yes, in a way.
And those lectures you mentioned, they were official?
They were published after in 2016, in 16.
But he gave those lectures in his private house?
Yes, okay. Privately, and it was published in samizdat only. And
only one comment, because I took part in an action art performance, and what I experienced were both perspectives, both matter in some way, because we played the social roles. It was about that, just to put it shortly, and we had the audience outside, and the point was not to make division artist or who was involved in action, but who was but to combine personal perspective, what I as an actor have experienced, and what you as a member of the audience have noticed, and so on. In that sense, the action art is not to be divided that way, audience versus action doing, but to combine.
Yes, it's really deconstructing.
The point was, I was bored in a way, just to share my experience, because I played some game which I didn't like actually, but it was interesting to observe it from the outside. For me as an actor was not, you know?
Yes.
It can be vice versa, yeah.
Yes, or this, I dislike it, is also interesting experience. I'm not in that, and so on. So, and it's really deconstructing the expectations or awakenings, and redirecting this redirection of experience, yes, from different.
In my experience, it was much more comfortable from the outside than from inside.
Okay. Thank you for the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.